Hello, neighbors. Before we get into the episode, just a couple quick things I'd like to mention. If you go to the podcast website, neighborontheLeft.com, there's a whole bunch of things for you to check out there, including the contacts page, where you can see all of the social media links. And these days, I do post a lot of stuff just about daily on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. A lot of interesting stuff there. If you stop by, please like, share, and follow if you would. Also on the website, there is the episodes section where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, the blog section. I make a post for every episode of the podcast, and it includes all of the sources that I use. All right, let's start the episode. Oh, the Constitution. You know who really loves the Constitution? Conservatives. Just ask them. They carry pocket-sized copies of it. They quote the founding fathers. They say constitutional republic with the solemnity of someone announcing the location of buried treasure. They talk about original intent and strict construction and limited government and states' rights and the sacred wisdom of men who died before indoor plumbing was invented. They love the Constitution. Or at least they love saying the word Constitution. It works beautifully as a buzzword. It fits on bumper stickers. It looks serious in campaign mailers. It gives the speaker an instant glow of powdered wig patriotism. And usually, when conservatives talk about the Constitution, they're talking mostly about two parts. The First Amendment, whenever a conservative says something awful and people react to it, and the Second Amendment, always the Second Amendment. But the Constitution is a good bit longer than that. There are other amendments. There are limits on presidential power. There are protections for people accused by the government. There are restrictions on searches. There are rules about citizenship. There are voting rights. There are presidential term limits. There are states with powers of their own. There are courts. There is Congress. There is an entire system built around the radical idea that no president should be allowed to do whatever he wants simply because enough people cheered for him. And since Donald Trump took office this second time, the people who spent decades presenting themselves as the Constitution's personal security detail have become remarkably relaxed about all of that. Due process depends who needs it. States' rights depends which state. Free speech depends who's speaking. Birthright citizenship, that's apparently negotiable. Presidential term limits, well, there might be a clever workaround. Court orders, well, unless the judge is corrupt. Congressional authority, well, sure, unless the president finds it inconvenient. It's amazing how quickly originalism becomes improvisational once the original words tell Donald Trump no. So fine, let's talk about the Constitution, not the souvenir version, not the campaign prop version, not the version MAGA keeps folded neatly in a pocket while ignoring every page that interferes with executive power. The whole thing. Because loving the Constitution is easy when it protects something you already like. The test comes when it protects something you dislike, when it restrains the president you love, when it gives power to a state that votes the wrong way, when it tells your political movement no. That's when the constitutional devotion becomes real. And that's exactly when so many so-called constitutional conservatives seem to forget where they put it. Greetings, neighbors. Happy Wednesday, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, a podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological mud. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. Today, we're talking about the Constitution. Actually, we're going through the Constitution, amendment by amendment, principle by principle, and asking one Very simple question. When did all these rules become optional? Because this isn't really about whether Donald Trump respects the Constitution. His relationship with limits in general has never been mysterious. This is about the people who spent years calling themselves constitutional conservatives only to discover that constitutional restraint becomes terribly inconvenient when it restrains their guy. So we are going to look at speech and searches and due process and citizenship, states' rights, voting rights, presidential term limits, and the checks designed to keep one man from swallowing the rest of the government. Not because the Constitution is perfect, because the people claiming to worship it keep treating it like a menu. For decades, conservatives have treated the Constitution like a private club where they get to control the guest list. They are strict constructionalists, the originalists, the people who know what the founders really meant. Liberals in this story are always trying to stretch the document, rewrite it, modernize it, or sneak new rights into the margins. Conservatives simply read the words. That has always been the sales pitch. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with caring about constitutional text. There is nothing wrong with studying the founders, debating original meaning, or carrying a pocket constitution. The problem comes when the pocket constitution is mostly used as a prop. Because the same movement that insists every word is sacred has developed a remarkable talent for finding hidden exceptions whenever the words interfere with Donald Trump. When the Constitution protects gun ownership, the language is absolute. When it protects conservative religious expression, the language is sacred. When a Republican state wants to resist a Democratic president, federalism becomes the very spine of liberty. But when due process protects an immigrant, well, now we're told not to be naive. When birthright citizenship protects an American-born child of undocumented parents, well, suddenly we're misreading the text. When the courts limit the president, judges are out of control. When Congress controls spending, they tell us the president should have flexibility. When the 22nd Amendment says a president cannot be elected more than twice, he makes comments, they say, relax, he's joking, repeatedly. While supporters print the t-shirts. Apparently, every constitutional provision is sacred until it tells Trump no. Then it becomes complicated. We hear that the founders never anticipated this. Then we hear that the president needs broader power, and we hear that the courts have suddenly become partisan. Then someone brings up something Barack Obama did, because nothing settles a constitutional question like pointing across the room and yelling a name of a president who hasn't been in office in over a decade. All of this is selective constitutionalism. It's not ordinary disagreement over interpretation. Reasonable people have argued over constitutional meaning from the very beginning. This is different. This is deciding the desired political outcome first, and then determining how firmly the Constitution should apply. If the text helps MAGA, read it strictly. If the text gets in the way, then you need to reinterpret it. If a court agrees, celebrate the rule of law. If the court disagrees, attack the judge. If a Republican state resists Washington, praise state sovereignty. If a Democratic state resists Trump, threaten its funding or send in federal power. That is not philosophy. That is political permission dressed up for a history pageant photograph. The Constitution is not valuable because it lets one political movement declare itself more patriotic than everyone else. It is valuable because it limits every political movement. Mine, yours, Trump's, whoever. The Constitution is not a vending machine where you insert patriotism and then receive permission. It is a set of rules telling powerful people what they are not allowed to do. And if your devotion disappears every time the answer is no, then no, you do not love the Constitution. You just love the authority you think it gives you. Conservatives, we'll start off with the First Amendment. Conservatives talk about free speech a lot. I mean, nearly constantly. Usually, when a conservative says something offensive and other people use their own free speech to call it offensive, then suddenly we hear the First Amendment is under attack. But the First Amendment does not guarantee applause. It doesn't guarantee a television contract, a university invitation, a social media following, or freedom from criticism. It protects you from government retaliation for protected speech. And that distinction becomes considerably less interesting, at least to MAGA, when the government doing the retaliating belongs to Donald Trump. In 2025, Trump issued executive orders targeting major law firms whose lawyers, clients, or former employees had been involved in cases and investigations he disliked. The orders threatened security clearances, federal contracts, access to government buildings, and relationships between federal agencies and those firms. That was not Trump posting an angry review of a lawyer, although he does that too. This was the president using federal power against legal organizations connected to his political enemies. Federal judges struck down several of those orders, finding that the government cannot punish law firms for their speech, associations, clients, or legal work. And that should have been obvious. The right to counsel means very little if the president can threaten an entire law firm for representing the wrong person. Imagine if President Biden issued an executive order against every firm that represented Donald Trump or challenged an abortion restriction or defended a gun manufacturer. Conservative media would have needed emergency backup studios just to contain the outrage. But when Trump does it, we're told he's fighting the deep state. Funny, I thought they loved this part. Then there's Harvard. The Trump administration froze or canceled billions of dollars in research funding while demanding sweeping changes to university governance, admissions, hiring, discipline, and academic life in general. Universities receiving federal money must obey civil rights law. Anti-Semitism is real and Jewish students deserve protection, but enforcing the law is not the same as using cancer research or medical studies or scientific grants as leverage to force a university into political submission. A federal judge ruled that the administration's funding cuts were unlawful and violated Harvard's First Amendment rights. Because the government may enforce neutral rules, it may not hold scientific research hostage until a university adopts the president's preferred ideology. That's the pattern. The administration does not need to formally ban speech. It can make free speech really expensive. It can make law firms afraid to take certain clients. It can make universities wonder whether criticism is worth losing research money. It can make journalists and protesters and professors and institutions calculate what government benefit might disappear if they don't comply. And that is not free speech. That is approved speech enforced through intimidation. The First Amendment matters most when the speaker irritates the government. It protects critics, opponents, protesters, lawyers, comedians, journalists, students, and professors. It does not exist merely to protect conservatives from being called jerks on the internet. And a movement that supports government retaliation against its critics is not defending free speech, no matter how many times they say the phrase. It's defending speech that has passed a loyalty test, and only that speech. So let's move on to the Fourth Amendment. And here's a sentence I never expected to say. Apparently, conservatives have become comfortable with armed federal agents stopping people on the street because they look like they might be immigrants. The Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable search and seizures. That includes being detained by the government without an adequate reason. Not every police encounter requires a warrant. Not every arrest is unconstitutional. Immigration officers do have lawful authority to investigate and arrest people. But the whole, we are looking for undocumented immigrants, is not a constitutional permission slip to stop every Latino man walking down the street or driving his car. During immigration operations around Los Angeles, federal agents conducted roving stops at places such as car washes and parking lots and businesses where they believed undocumented immigrants might work. One American citizen, Jason Gavidia, said agents stopped him outside a tow yard, pushing him against a fence, twisted his arm, took his phone, and repeatedly demanded to know whether he was American and which hospital he had been born in. He offered them his real ID. Apparently, the government's new citizenship test is remembering the maternity ward from several decades before, while armed men twist your arm. A federal court found substantial evidence that agents had conducted stops without reasonable suspicion, and an appeals court refused to fully suspend an order restricting that conduct while the case proceeded. And if you're paying attention to the news, you know that in just the last week or so, there have been 2 men killed by ICE agents, and coincidentally, neither of those men were the men that the ICE agents were actually looking for. Now, that in and of itself should tell you something right there. But anyway, the point is not that immigration agents may never question anyone. The point is that ethnicity, language, location, and occupation should not automatically be considered proof that someone is unlawfully present. Because once the government can seize people based on appearance and assumptions, citizenship will not protect you until after the agents decide whether they believe you. And that is the problem with MAGA's casual belief that constitutional rights only belong to citizens. I mean, that concept is nonsense. That concept has been ruled on and disproved numerous times. But in this particular situation, how exactly does the agent know who is a citizen before making the stop? Does everyone need to carry papers? Should American citizens expect to prove their birthplace while buying lumber or washing their car or going to the convenience store to get a drink? I seem to remember conservatives having really strong feelings about government agents demanding papers from Americans. Funny, I don't know. I thought they liked this whole due process thing. The Fourth Amendment is not a prize for people that the government already knows are innocent. It exists because government suspicion is not proof. It exists because agents can be wrong. It exists because an aggressive enforcement campaign creates pressure to stop first and justify later. And that has become a huge issue. And when the government does take someone away, the next question is even more important. Does that person get a meaningful chance to prove that the government was wrong? Which, now we're on to the Fifth Amendment, and this brings us to the sentence MAGA keeps trying to edit without going through the trouble of amending the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. No person. It doesn't say citizen. It doesn't say taxpayer. It says no person. It doesn't say no person whose immigration paperwork meets Stephen Miller's personal standards. It just says person. No person. And yet, whenever anyone objects to people being detained or deported without meaningful chance to challenge the government, the answer arrives immediately. They're not citizens. Maybe that's correct. That's why the Fifth Amendment says person. Non-citizens do not have every right that citizens have. They cannot vote in federal elections, despite all the BS that comes with the rhetoric about the SAVE Act. They generally do not have an unconditional right to enter the country. The federal government has broad power to enforce immigration law, But once the government takes someone into custody, labels them dangerous, and tries to remove them, due process matters. It means notice. It means real opportunity to respond. It means the government must establish that it has the right person and the legal authority to do what it is doing. Due process is not immunity from deportation. It is what prevents deportation from becoming accusation and error and punishment and exile with no meaningful way to object. Kilmar Abrego Garcia showed exactly why that matters. An immigration judge had previously barred his removal to El Salvador because he faced danger there. The Trump administration sent him there anyway, later acknowledging that the removal was improper. That's not a clerical error. A human being was delivered to a foreign prison despite a legal protection against sending him to that country. And instead of responding with urgency and humility, the administration attacked him publicly and fought over what it had to do to help to bring him back. That is authoritarian. That is the authoritarian shortcut in miniature. Remove first, justify later. And if the government made a mistake, then you smear the person until the mistake feels like it was not a mistake. Due process exists because governments make mistakes. Names get confused. Records can be wrong. Agents can make mistaken assumptions. Citizens have been detained during immigration operations. Many of them. The stories happen all the time, every week. People with legal status have been swept up. And when enforcement becomes more aggressive, the chance of error does not magically disappear because everyone involved is, going gung-ho with their masks and their tactical gear. Then Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act, a law written in 1798 for wartime to rapidly remove Venezuelan men accused of belonging to trendy Aragua. The Supreme Court said people targeted under that law must receive notice and a meaningful opportunity to challenge their removal before they're deported. Meaningful opportunity. Not a piece of paper handed over while the bus is pulling towards the airport. Not a theoretical right to find a lawyer after the government has shipped you to another country. A right you cannot use in time to help you is not due process. It's just decorative. And this is where the MAGA response becomes especially revealing. They hear due process and think liberals are trying to protect criminals. No, that is not accurate. Due process determines whether the person is actually who the government says they are, whether the accusation is supported, whether the removal is legal, whether the government is sending someone to a country where a court has already said they cannot be sent. You cannot use the accusation as the excuse for eliminating the process that tests the accusation. I realize that can be a little tricky to wrap your mind around, but it's not that tricky. Doing that is not law and order. That is order without law. Rights do not become less constitutional because the person exercising them is not popular. In fact, I would say that's when they matter the most. Due process is easy to support when the accused person looks innocent or speaks perfect English or has a sympathetic family and appears on television, in a cardigan sweater. The test comes when the government calls someone a gang member, an invader, an enemy, or an illegal alien. That's when the Constitution asks whether we require proof or simply just applaud the label. You can support deportation laws and still understand that the government has to deport the correct person. You can demand border enforcement and still insist that the government follow court orders. You can believe someone should be removed and still believe the government must establish that fact legally before putting them on a plane. That's not being soft. That is following the Constitution. That is constitutional government. Without due process, your freedom depends on the government never being wrong. And no one who has paid any attention to any government under any party should be comfortable making that bet. And how about states' rights? You remember those, right? Republicans used to mention them, I don't know, every 12 to 13 minutes. Washington was too powerful. Decisions belonged closer to the people. Governors understood their states better than federal bureaucrats. Local control was the beating heart of freedom. Then Democratic states started making decisions Donald Trump disliked. And apparently states' rights are like coupons, only valid at participating Republican locations. Take sanctuary jurisdictions. There is no single national sanctuary policy. Different cities and states place different limits on how their police, jails, and public employees cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. You can support those policies or you can oppose them. But there is a constitutional distinction between blocking federal officers and refusing to turn local government into an unpaid extension of ICE. The federal government may enforce federal immigration law. What it generally cannot do is simply order states and local officials to administer that law for them. Trump's administration responded by identifying sanctuary jurisdictions, suing cities and states, and threatening federal funding. And that is quite a transformation. When Texas resisted the Biden administration over immigration, Republicans treated Governor Greg Abbott like the last living guardian of American sovereignty. When California or New York refuses to use local resources exactly as Trump demands, suddenly federalism becomes insubordination. Republican states get sovereignty. Democratic states get supervision. And then Trump took the principle even further in California. After the protests erupted around immigration operations in LA in June of last year, Trump federalized thousands of California National Guard members over the governor's objection. Some protesters committed crimes. Those people could be arrested and prosecuted. California has police. Los Angeles has police. Newsom had the guard available under state authority. Trump took control away. The administration argued that federal personnel and property required protection and that federal law could not otherwise be enforced. California challenged the move, and the legal fight became complicated, with courts disagreeing over how much authority and deference the president possessed under the statute he invoked. But the political message was wonderfully simple. A Democratic governor said no. Donald Trump decided no was merely an opening offer. Now, imagine President Obama taking control of the Texas National Guard over Greg Abbott's objection and deploying it into Dallas. Fox News would have constructed a permanent constitutional emergency studio. Ted Cruz would probably still be filibustering. There would be commemorative challenge coins. Federalism does not mean states may ignore valid federal law. Immigration is primarily federal. Congress also has constitutional authority in areas affecting federal elections. But governors are not regional managers for the White House. Mayors are not federal subcontractors. State employees do not work for Donald Trump. And the 10th Amendment does not come with a partisan zip code restriction. If local control matters, it matters when California says no. It matters when New York says no. And it matters even if the president is angry. Maybe more so then. Because if states possess autonomy only when they agree with the president, that's not federalism. That's permission, and Trump has never been especially interested in sharing permission. So let's talk about the 14th Amendment. Donald Trump signed an executive order on his first day back in office declaring that certain children born in the United States would no longer be recognized as American citizens. Let me pause there for a second. A president tried to change the meaning of the 14th Amendment with an executive order. The people who spend decades insisting that the Constitution can be changed only through the formal amendment process suddenly became open to a faster option. One man with a big Sharpie. One extremely convenient interpretation. The 14th Amendment says that all persons born naturalized in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction are citizens. That's it. Trump's order targeted children born here when their mothers were undocumented and their fathers were neither citizens nor lawful permanent residents. It also targeted some children whose mothers were legally present on temporary visas. The child could be born in Pennsylvania, grow up in Pennsylvania, attend American schools, know no other country, but under Trump's theory, that child's citizenship would depend on the immigration status of parents at the moment of the child's birth. The administration built its argument around the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof. It claimed that children of undocumented immigrants and temporary visitors were not covered because their parents retained allegiance to another country. But undocumented immigrants are certainly subject to American jurisdiction when the government wants to arrest them, or prosecute them, or tax them, or detain them, or deport them. Apparently, the United States has complete jurisdiction when it wants power over the parents, but mysteriously insufficient jurisdiction when the Constitution grants citizenship to the child. That's a wonderfully efficient interpretation. Maximum government authority, minimum constitutional obligation. On June 30th of this year, Supreme Court rejected Trump's position and held that children born in the United States to parents who are unlawfully or temporarily present are still citizens at birth. The court did not discover some new liberal right hiding in a footnote. It just read the citizenship clause. And you know, the scariest part of that was that it wasn't unanimous. Birthright citizenship is written into the Constitution. It is not a customer service policy that Trump can cancel because he dislikes receiving it. And there is a reason that the rule was placed there. Before the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision declared that black people could not be citizens of the United States. After the Civil War, the country wrote citizenship directly into the Constitution so that belonging would no longer depend on whether politicians or judges or state governments considered a particular person worthy. The amendment created a clear rule. And a lot of the arguments that you see on social media bring up that whole slavery thing. They insist that the rule was only applicable to former slaves and their children. And it's an interesting theory with absolutely no basis whatsoever in the Constitution. The Constitution says nothing of the kind. If you are born here and subject to American jurisdiction, you are an American. Trump's order would have replaced that certainty with inherited status. Your rights would depend not simply on where you were born, but on who your parents were and whether the government approved of them. And that's not a minor change. That creates a class of children born inside the United States, governed by the United States, and raised in the United States, but denied membership because of their bloodline. And the 14th Amendment did more than establish citizenship. It also says states may not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, or deny any person equal protection under the laws. There is that word again, person. The amendment distinguishes between citizens and persons because the Constitution does. Citizenship carries rights that non-citizens do not have, but personhood still protects human beings from arbitrary government treatment. MAGA keeps acting as though constitutional rights are activated by a membership card. And they're not. They're not. The government does not get to declare someone outside the Constitution simply because it dislikes that person's immigration status. That is what makes this attack so revealing. The right spent years, most of my life, demanding strict adherence to constitutional text. Then it reached the citizenship clause and discovered interpretive dance. They tell us to read the Constitution. Fine. Actually read it. The 14th Amendment is not unclear in any way, especially because Donald Trump wants a different answer. It says who is a citizen, it says who is a person, and it says government does not get to erase either one merely because equality has become politically inconvenient. Moving on. The 15th Amendment says the right to vote cannot be denied or abridged because of race. And that sounds pretty straightforward, which is probably why American politicians spent the next century inventing methods that avoided writing black people can't vote while accomplishing something remarkably close to it. Poll taxes and literacy tests, white primaries, registration traps, and now district maps and election rolls that can weaken minority voting power without ever printing the motive in bold letters. And we should be precise here. Partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering are not identical. Drawing a crooked district to help Republicans is anti-democratic, but it does not automatically violate the 15th Amendment. Using race to dilute political power of black voters is a different constitutional problem, often involving the 15th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the Voting Rights Act. The point is not merely whether a black voter is physically allowed to enter a polling place. The point is whether the government may deliberately make that vote count much less. And since Trump returned to office, his Justice Department has not exactly behaved like an agency urgently searching for racial discrimination in elections. In March of last year, 2025, Attorney General Pam Bondi withdrew the federal government from its lawsuit challenging Georgia's 2021 voting law. The earlier Justice Department had alleged that Republican lawmakers adopted parts of that law with the purpose of discriminating against black voters. The Trump Justice Department just dismissed that claim as false and walked away. That does not prove that the Georgia law violated the Constitution. The lawsuit had not produced a final judgment, but it tells us something about priorities. The federal office historically responsible for protecting voting rights arrived under new management and quickly decided that pursuing claims of racial voter suppression was no longer where it wanted to spend its energy. Meanwhile, the administration has poured enormous effort hunting for non-citizen voting, demanding voter information, and threatening election officials, despite the persistent lack of any evidence that non-citizen voting is occurring on anything resembling the scale that MAGA advertises. So the Civil Rights Division becomes less interested in whether black voting power is being weakened, but intensely interested in a fraud narrative that just coincidentally helps Donald Trump distrust elections that he might lose. It's funny how that works. The 15th Amendment was not written because racial discrimination in voting had ended. It was written because officials were skilled at disguising it. And a movement that celebrates every new obstacle while weakening the institutions meant to protect minority voters does not get to point at an open polling place door and declare the constitutional work is finished. The standard needs to be higher than that. A vote can be accepted and still be deliberately stripped of power. That's why the amendment says denied or abridged. And then there's the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. And to be clear, repealing it is not an official Trump administration policy. It's not in the Republican platform. There's no serious congressional effort with any realistic chance of removing women from the electorate. But you're blind if you don't know there's a growing corner of the MAGA-aligned right where questioning women's suffrage has become acceptable content. Pastors and Christian nationalist activists have promoted this concept of household voting, meaning one vote per family, generally speaking, cast by the husband. Far-right personalities like Nick Fuentes have openly argued that women should not vote. And in 2025, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth shared a video featuring pastors from his church network discussing opposition to women's suffrage and the repeal of the 19th Amendment. Now, the Pentagon later insisted that Hegseth supports women's right to vote. Well, good. That's reassuring. It would have been even more reassuring if the Secretary of Defense hadn't promoted a video featuring people arguing the opposite. But, And at a 2026 Turning Point USA Women's Summit, some attendees told reporters they would surrender their own voting rights if they believed doing so would create a more conservative country. I can't even wrap my mind around the stupidity of that phrase. I'm going to say it again. They would surrender their own voting rights if they believed doing so would create a more conservative country. Think about how far the conversation has moved. Repealing women's right to vote should not be edgy conservative content. It should not be a provocative podcast comment. It shouldn't be treated as an amusing thought experiment by a movement forever lecturing everyone else about constitutional fidelity. Imagine prominent liberals seriously discussing whether men should still be allowed to vote. We never hear the end of it. And rightly so. And if your response to that is, well, that would be ridiculous, so is the other thing. But as I said, this is not administration policy. It is movement culture. It is a political ecosystem becoming comfortable with the idea that constitutional rights may be withdrawn from people because a lot of them vote the wrong way. Apparently, the 19th Amendment is sacred too. I mean, unless women keep voting Democrat. And that brings us to the 22nd Amendment. President cannot be elected more than twice. And that's not just the norm. It's not just a tradition. It's not a polite suggestion. It's part of the Constitution. And yet, throughout 2025, Trump repeatedly teased the possibility of another term. He said there were methods for doing it. He talked about people wanting him to stay. His official store, sells Trump 2028 hats and t-shirts with the phrase, rewrite the rules. How subtle. Representative Andy Ogles even introduced a constitutional amendment designed to let Trump sink another term while carefully preventing most other living two-term presidents from receiving the same opportunity. That's also convenient. So apparently the Constitution may be amended, provided the amendment is custom tailored to one specific customer. Trump later acknowledged that the 22nd Amendment bars him from seeking another elected term, and Republican leaders said there is no realistic path to changing that in time. Well, good, because that's the correct answer. But it should not have required months of teasing merchandise and loophole chatter and elected Republicans pretending a third Trump term was an exciting constitutional puzzle. Imagine, I keep saying this, imagine if Barack Obama repeatedly said that there might be a way for him to run again. Imagine if Obama opened an online store selling Obama 2028 rewrite the rules hats. Imagine a Democratic congressman proposing a constitutional amendment specifically written to return Obama to office. I mean, you don't really have to even imagine the conservative reaction. You would be able to hear it from here with your TV turned off. There would have been hearings and lawsuits and emergency broadcasts and, marches. But when Trump does it, we're told, just relax. He's joking. He's trolling. 22nd Amendment does not contain an exception for presidents with branded merchandise, and constitutional limits don't become harmless simply because the person testing them smiles when he's doing it. A movement that truly reveres the Constitution should not spend months searching for a clever way around one of its clearest rules. It should just say no. It should just immediately say no and let us all move on. So, the Constitution is not just a list of rights. It's also a machine built to prevent one person from controlling everything. We have checks and balances. Congress writes the laws and controls federal spending. The president executes those laws. The courts decide what the law permits. The branches overlap and argue and obstruct one another and occasionally make everyone miserable, but that is not a design flaw. That is the design. The founders did not create checks and balances because they trusted presidents. They created them because they did not. Donald Trump's theory of government appears to be much simpler. He won the election, therefore everyone else should move out of the way. Start with money. Congress decides how federal money is spent. The president may ask Congress to cancel funding, and Congress may agree. What the president generally cannot do is treat an appropriation as a presidential suggestion box. But Trump's administration repeatedly froze, delayed, or terminated money Congress had already approved for programs that it disliked. The Government Accountability Office concluded in several different cases that agencies violated federal budget law by withholding appropriated funds for policy reasons. It's not complicated. Trump also attempted a so-called pocket rescission, timing a request so close to the end of the fiscal year that Congress could not realistically reject it before the money expired. That's not budget discipline. That is trying to win a separation of powers argument by using the clock. And notice the constitutional switcheroo. Republicans insist that only Congress can spend money whenever a Democratic president proposes, student debt relief or another policy they oppose. But when Trump wants to refuse spending Congress already ordered, suddenly the president becomes the guardian of the national wallet. Congress is not an advisory committee. Then there are the watchdogs. We've talked about this recently. Within days of returning to office, Trump fired inspectors general across major federal agencies. Inspectors general investigate waste, fraud, and abuse, the thing that, Trump and Vance tell us they are so much against. They also investigate misconduct inside the executive branch. They're not a separate constitutional branch, but Congress created them to provide independent oversight within agencies controlled by the president. Federal law required advance notice to Congress and specific reasons for removing those individuals. And Trump just ignored those requirements. Federal judge later concluded that the firings were unlawful, although she declined to reinstate the watchdogs because Trump could remove them again after following the legal process. Now think about that message for a second. The administration that campaigned on rooting out government waste by firing the people whose actual job it was to find government waste, and then the judge refuses to overturn the firings because they could be done the right way. Apparently fraud is intolerable unless someone independent might have to investigate it, I guess. And then there's civil service. Most federal employees are not supposed to be political loyalists. They serve under presidents of both parties. Their job is to administer the law, provide expertise, maintain records, and sometimes explain that the thing the president wants can't legally or practically happen. Trump has spent years portraying that independence as the deep state. His administration created a new employment category covering policy influencing career workers, making it easier to remove them and weakening protections against political firing. And the official explanation is accountability. I guess the question is accountability to whom? To the law, to the public, or to Donald Trump? A professional civil service can absolutely become slow or insulated or resistant to change. Employees who perform badly should face consequences, but there is a vast difference between removing someone for misconduct and removing someone because professional advice doesn't sound loyal enough to you. A government staffed primarily by people afraid to contradict the president is a lot of things, but it's not more accountable. It's less capable of telling him when he's wrong, and that is not a good thing. And then, of course, we reach the courts. Trump routinely attacks judges who rule against him, portraying adverse decisions not as legal disagreements, but as corruption and bias and political sabotage. His allies argue that judges should not be able to restrain presidential action. I don't even know how they say these things with a straight face. That idea cuts straight through the heart of the constitutional system. A court order is not legitimate only when the president agrees with it. Judicial review means the executive branch does not get the final word on the limits of executive power. Now, of course, courts can be wrong. Judges can overreach. Decisions can be appealed and reversed. But the constitutional response to a ruling you oppose is an appeal. Not personal threats, not public intimidation, not deciding that the judge's authority disappears because, the president won an election. Checks and balances are frustrating because they are supposed to be frustrating. Congress can refuse, courts can block, watchdogs can investigate, career employees can object, states can resist federal demands. That friction prevents efficiency of a very particular kind. The efficiency of one man giving an order and the entire government immediately obeying. A president who never hears no is not powerful in a constitutional system. He is dangerous to it. And a movement that treats every check as illegitimate is not defending the Constitution. It is clearing the Constitution out of the president's way. So now step back from the amendments for a second, the executive orders, the court cases, the raids, the maps, the funding threats, the third term jokes, and the rest of it, and look at the pattern. Because this isn't really about one constitutional dispute. It's about a political movement that increasingly treats the Constitution as valid only when it produces the outcome that it wants. The First Amendment matters when conservatives are speaking. The Fourth Amendment matters when conservatives fear government intrusion. The 10th Amendment matters when Republican states resist Washington. The Second Amendment, of course, is treated as though it were printed in larger type than the rest. But when the Constitution protects an immigrant, when it guarantees citizenship to a child MAGA would rather exclude, when it restrains a president, when it empowers a democratic state, when it protects minority voting power, when it limits Trump to 2 terms, suddenly the certainty disappears. The text becomes debatable. The history becomes complicated. The limit becomes unfair. The judge is corrupt. The state is defiant. The right becomes a loophole search. That is not constitutional fidelity. That's just team loyalty, period. Team loyalty is easy. You cheer when your side wins. You excuse what you would condemn from the other side. You call power legitimate when your leader uses it and tyranny when your opponent does. You do not need a constitution for that. You just need a jersey. The whole point of constitutional government is that the rules are supposed to survive elections. They do not belong to the winning party. They do not disappear for 4 years because your candidate received more votes. They don't become optional because the president claims it's an emergency or promises revenge or insists that only he can fix everything. The Constitution is bigger than Donald Trump, and it's bigger than the Republican Party, and it's bigger than the Democratic Party. And yes, it's bigger than my politics or your politics, whatever they may be. That is the part that matters. Because I do not prove I believe in constitutional limits by demanding that they restrain Trump. I prove it by accepting that those same limits restrain all the presidents, even the ones I support. If a Democratic president tried to punish law firms for representing Republicans, I should oppose it. If a Democratic president tried to redefine citizenship by executive order, I should oppose it. If a Democratic president tried to take control of a Republican state's National Guard for political theater, I should oppose it. If Barack Obama had floated a 3rd term and sold merchandise about rewriting the rules, conservatives would have been right to condemn it. Principle means the rule does not change with the name on the door. That is the test that MAGA keeps failing. They don't love the Constitution. They love constitutional permission. They love the parts that authorize, the parts that protect them, the parts that they can use as weapons against somebody But the Constitution is not sacred if every inconvenient sentence becomes negotiable. Patriotism without principle is just merchandising. And a pocket constitution is just a campaign merchandise if you never let it tell your side no. Constitution was never designed to make power comfortable. It was designed to slow power down, to divide it, to frustrate it, to force presidents to answer to Congress, to force governments to answer to courts, to protect people who can't protect themselves from the state, to protect the accused before the government decides accusation is enough, to protect the unpopular speaker, the unwanted immigrant, the minority voter, the child whose citizenship becomes politically inconvenient, the state whose governor refuses to fall in line, the citizen standing at the door asking whether the agents outside actually have the authority to come in. That is what the Constitution limits are for. Not the easy cases, the hard ones. The cases where fear is high and anger is useful and power is impatient. That is when the Constitution matters most. And that is exactly when MAGA keeps asking us to look the other way. Ignore the process. Trust the president. Assume the accusation is true. Let the government move quickly. Stop asking questions. Stop listening to judges. Stop worrying about Congress. Stop pretending the rules matter more than the result. But once you accept that, once you let that happen, the Constitution is no longer governing power. Power is governing the Constitution. Every inconvenient rule becomes flexible. Every limit is partisan. Every court is illegitimate. Every watchdog is disloyal. Every state that resists is the enemy. Every protection lasts only until the president decides the person using it doesn't deserve it. That's not constitutional government. That's government by permission from one man. The Constitution does not need another flag pin. It does not need another speech about the founders. It doesn't need another politician holding up a pocket copy while ignoring the pages that obstruct him. It just needs obedience, especially when obedience costs power. Anyone can wave a flag, and anyone can quote James Madison, and anyone can call himself a constitutional conservative. The hard part is defending the Constitution when it protects someone that you don't like. The hard part is following it when it blocks the president that you adore. The hard part is accepting that no election, no emergency, no political movement, and no man can stand above it. That's the test. And the people who spent years insisting they love the Constitution are failing that test in public daily. Because the difference between loving the Constitution and using it as a campaign pin is very simple. You let it tell your side no. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I am incredibly grateful, and I would love to hear from you about this topic especially, but about any topic, honestly. Go to the website, neighborontheleft.com. Go to the contacts page, like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. Drop me a line, ask me a question, give me a critique or a compliment or whatever it is that you want to send out there. And I'll be back on Friday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. It's Friday, so it'll be a Back Porch Files episode. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.